This week on The Right Side, Canadian oil is discounted due to lack of transport. A BC court case reveals immigration loopholes. A far-right group attends Trudeau's town hall to the delight of the CBC. And a fake hijab cutting incident sparks a rapid condemnation of Islamophobia. This is The Right Side, episode 52, recorded Saturday, January 20th, 2018. Cutting through Clickbait. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Patrick and myself are back this week. Welcome back.
Good to be back with a lot of interesting news happening this week.
Yeah, definitely. Probably, perhaps the biggest fake news story of 2018 so far, but we'll get to that in just a bit. But in case you're joining us for the first time, The Right Side is a podcast where we attempt to cut through the bias and sensationalism that you often find in the mainstream media. And, well, let's just say that it's quite rampant this week. So if you guys want to follow along for this episode, you can find full show notes at rightsidenews.ca. And let's begin. We're going to start off in Alberta this week, and this is actually not only an issue for Alberta, this story, but it's also a big deal for Canada as a whole, because Canada has, over the last number of years become an energy economy where we need to sell our energy to the world, but we can't do that if we're not getting the appropriate prices for it. And that's what this story is about. And that is that Canadian oil is actually still selling below the actual market value that is reported on the news each night. So you see that, a barrel of oil is approaching roughly $60 US per barrel. And you would think that ordinarily this is a good thing for Canada. And yes, it would have been a great thing back in the summer of 2015 and 2014 when we started to have that massive oil crater price hit the floor, but unfortunately the situation has actually got a lot worse then. So when you have the price for oil, it's displayed as the per barrel pricing, and the price we hear and that the media reports on and is reported on in the financial news most times, if you're just getting a very top-down view of it, is something called the WTI market value, and that's the value that the world uses, the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. Now, Canadian oil sells for a lot less than the WTI. Ours sells at a benchmark called WCS, which stands for Western Canadian Select. So as we're heading towards North American oil pricing of roughly $65 a barrel, the oil that's coming out of Alberta is selling for as much as $25 less per barrel on the international market. So that's putting Alberta oil this month at roughly $40 per barrel US, even though the international price for oil is approaching $65 a barrel. And it was long said that during the oil collapse of 2014, 2015, 2016, that if we could get up and, maintain $60 to $70 barrels per oil and get our fiscal house in order, that would be a great thing for the province. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet due to this massive pricing cut of Canadian oil selling at $40 per barrel US. And, this pricing gap has always existed, but it's actually become a lot more pronounced in the last 6 months. On average, it used to hover below $10 to $15 below the American price, but has since deepened to $25 less than the American price over the last couple months. And when you expand that across the entire oil industry, that's a lot of money lost. That's almost half the value right there. If you take $10 and we're going to subtract an additional 10 from it, that's a lot. So this is a big deal for Alberta and Canada as a whole. Now, you might be wondering what's causing this, but this is actually due to more oil rigs coming online in Alberta and increasing the supply of oil in Alberta. And, we can produce all the oil we want, but if we don't have a way to get it out and sell it to the rest of the world, then we're really not making much money on that oil. And that's the problem that we're seeing right here. And that's what's caused the huge price cut. Now, it's not only that we can't get our goods to market, it's also due to the fact that there was a temporary shutdown of a portion of the Keystone Pipeline in South Dakota this past November after a spill happened there. And this is ultimately hampering the amount of money that oil producers bring in. And as we know, they pay royalties to the provincial government here in Alberta. So that means less money coming into the government of Alberta for services and whatnot. So the solution to this on the oil front is to simply get access to more markets, and that means more pipelines. The next major pipeline project to come online is Enbridge's Line 3, which could finish in late 2019 at the earliest. And that's a key word right there, at the earliest, because that's a year and a half away at most, and that's a long time to wait to have this huge oil price cut for our goods that we want to sell to the international market. And we're also waiting for the Trans Mountain pipeline in BC to be complete, or actually have its construction started, and same goes for the Keystone XL pipeline that was recently approved in the United States. So there's two pipelines that are going to hopefully be built, and once those get built, that will also help the situation that we're in. Now, imagine our capacity to get the oil to market if we had Trans Mountain, if we had Keystone XL, Line 3, if we had all of those three running, which we will hopefully at some point. But now also imagine what that would be like if we had Energy East and Northern Gateway, if those two pipelines had not have been stopped in the case of Energy East by the company in question and Northern Gateway being shuttered by the federal government. So, compounding this as a problem for the province and the governing NDP is that in their 2017 and 2018 budget, they based that budget on a WTI price of oil at $55 per barrel US and a Western Canadian Select price at around $51 a barrel. So that's $11 right there that this government is not expecting to recoup. But thankfully, in the last month, the price of oil has really shot up. The WTI price of oil in the last month has been hovering at around $60 per barrel, while Western Canada Select is at roughly $50 a barrel. So we'll have to wait and see if we're able to maintain this Western Canada Select pricing here at roughly $50 a barrel. If we end up having... And I should clarify, that $50 per barrel of Western Canada Select that the provincial government used to create their budget was in Canadian dollars, whereas the Western Canadian Select prices we have right now are at roughly $40 US per barrel. So we're thankful in a position with the US exchange rate that $40 per barrel US right now is roughly that $50 per barrel Canadian. So we're just going to have to keep our fingers crossed that the economic climate here continues to be good for the exchange rate of selling that oil to the Americans. Now, as I mentioned, you could always say that, $40 per barrel is a good price because we are meeting the fiscal guidelines in this case that the government met here. But at the same time, if the exchange rate goes bad, there goes that idea. If the price of oil goes down, that's another problem. And all of this could ultimately be fixed by shrinking the gap between Western Canada Select and the WTI pricing of oil. So we're going to have to watch this and wait and see. But nonetheless, it is definitely something that Canada as a whole should try and rectify, because energy projects that deal with crossing provincial boundaries are a federal jurisdiction. So this is partially to blame on the federal government, but also the provincial government definitely needs to watch their coffers and ensure that this is not going to be a problem going forward.
Yeah, especially when the price of the Western Canada Select is roughly 60% of what the WTI price is. It means that when we're selling our oil, it's a lot cheaper than what the Americans' oil is being sold for. The problem with that is that the amount of cost that it takes to get our Canadian oil out of the ground in Alberta is a lot higher than it is for the Americans to do it, because it's not the traditional crude oil. So the amount of money that it takes to get that oil out of the ground is already pretty significant.
Exactly.
And then if you're selling the oil for less, it means that there's even less of a margin of profit, which is not going to entice companies to want to invest more into the Canadian oil market either. And if that happens, the whole economy could collapse once more, and we've already seen this in Alberta. So we definitely don't want to see that happen again, because that could have a huge impact on the Canadian economy as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it all comes back to getting those pipelines built and getting the oil out to the international market to shrink that gap and reduce the supply that Alberta has of the oil. And then that'll reduce the gap, and that'll, as you said, encourage more investment. And, if the exchange rate goes bad, that's going to be a problem for the provincial government. It's also going to be a problem if the price of oil goes down and doesn't maintain where it's at right now over the last month. So.
Right. And as if with everything in economics, it seems like a lot of this is going to go back to the NAFTA negotiations and to see what's going to happen with that. So a lot of the impact of this story will actually be felt on not just the provincial government who sets all these guidelines, but also the federal government who's negotiating on all Canadians' behalf. And the deal that they get for us with NAFTA, if a deal actually happens, is really going to impact our oil economy in general. And that's probably one of the major sticking points in negotiations, I bet.
Indeed. All right. What do you got for us in BC this week?
Okay, so in BC is a bit quiet on the political front again. In fact, the whole month has been quiet, but there's been a couple of things that have happened that have been very newsworthy. And one was a BC Supreme Court case that highlighted the tactics of two wealthy Chinese families and how they worked together to create an elaborate immigration, tax, and real estate scam. Now, the Fu and Shu families had worked together for at least a decade to purchase properties in Vancouver and to skirt around landed immigrant rules to dodge hefty taxes. And they actually fell out over the purchase of three multi-million dollar properties in West Vancouver, and they went to court to settle their difference. Now, during the court case, many illegal immigration and tax schemes were actually revealed to have been done by not just these two families, but a lot of other foreign families in how they're trying to get purchase property in BC. And these are mostly it shows the range of the common and mostly unpunished migration and real estate scams that are occurring in Canada today. Said Vancouver immigration lawyer Sam Hyman, he said, quote, "This case provides unusually candid insight into what those who would abuse our immigration and real estate systems really think in their own words about their true motives for seeking access to Canada and our real estate." So these, in an article of the Vancouver Sun by Douglas Todd, there were some techniques that were used to skirt around Canadian law, and he lists them as such. Number one, not declaring full worldwide income to Canadian tax officials. Now, one family's breadwinner declared to the CRA that he had a worldwide income of only $97.11. Said Judge Susan Griffin, this was an incredible assertion given the fact that he owns one of the top 10 textile manufacturing and distribution companies in China's biggest production zone. Now, number two, they pretend to spend time in Canada to meet residency requirements. One family's member referred to staying in Canada as, quote, immigration jail. And the requirements ask would-be immigrants to physically spend 2 years out of 5 in Canada to retain their permanent residency status. And many in the family would be skirting around this residency requirement and trying to use as many loopholes as they could. Now, they were also hiding real estate ownership. A way for them to avoid or to evade paying capital gains tax in Canada was by putting the dwellings in the names of children or spouses who appear to be permanent residents of Canada and who appear, at least on paper, to occupy the houses, but don't actually in reality. There was also a lack of regulation of real estate agents in this case. One of the son's phony claims about spending time in Canada were actually coordinated by the family's realtor, identified only as Mr. Gu, and the realtor assisted the son by helping provide false paychecks, false employment records, and false verbal claims about losing his permanent resident card while in China. And it also highlighted the fact that they were illicitly laundering money out of China. The Fu family, to avoid detection, used their employees on 21 occasions to transfer lump sums just under China's restriction against removing more than 50,000 US a year from the country. And it was also found that they were misusing provincial migration programs. The two families from China initially started their application process to move to and invest in Canada by going through the provincial nominee programs of PEI and Manitoba, jurisdictions which, of course, lack the popularity of Metro Vancouver and Toronto for migrants. Neither family actually showed any intention of settling in those provinces, since as soon as they got to Canada, they immediately put all their efforts into investing in residential real estate in West Vancouver. And all of this has shown that they're also exploiting Canadian courts with costly trials. Now, it costs Canadian taxpayers a great deal to provide the judges, buildings, and the legal staff to run the court system, even when the losing side has to contribute to the opponent's lawyer fees. So the bitterest irony in all this is that those who would so brazenly thwart our laws with such perceived impunity for personal gain would actually turn to the taxpayer-funded legal system for recourse. So with all of this, it's quite clear that the government has to make an effort to crack down on these literal illegal immigrants. And it's cases like these that are contributing to the real estate problems in BC. And when such a problem exists in evading taxes by people who can clearly pay for it, it's clear that something needs to be done about this.
This is an angle that you would expect to hear more about on the real estate issues, specifically of the Lower Mainland, because I think there's no doubt that the Lower Mainland and Toronto are two of the biggest drivers of where new immigrants choose to settle in Canada. Now, there was talk in the BC election, I think, correct me if I was wrong, about resolving the Lower Mainland housing issue by providing more units of affordable housing for some extraordinary amount of money, I think, right?
Right. The NDP were going to add in a bunch of low cost income housing. The Greens did and still want to ban all foreign ownership of housing, and the Liberals wanted to raise the foreign buyers tax as well. So all three parties were wanting to do something in general to help the housing cost issues in Vancouver specifically, but also in Victoria and across the province. Now, whether any of those or all of those would be effective at all is another question for another day, of course, but they all did want to do something about it.
Yeah. And
but it seems like that something isn't very much.
Right, that something is not very much. And, based on the story that we have here, it certainly looks like we have a case, a peer abuse of the immigration system in Canada here. And, granted, this is only a handful of scams. There are 7 scams here on the details. But the fact is that when you declare an income of $97.11, you're coming from China. When we know how much international airfare costs to get from Beijing to Vancouver, for example, your income is more than $97.11 per year. So, it's absolutely astounding that there were no alarm bells set off by this. And the people who are enforcing immigration in BC need to focus on the people of BC who already live in the Lower Mainland and Canadians in general, and stamp out these kind of migration scams that we have here. Because if we don't do this, then we're in a situation here where it's quite clear that people can just come in, abuse the system, and win, whereas Canadians are forced to do a lot more to win and get those houses, which is really unfortunate. The people in power need to be focused on the Canadians first.
It's very true, and by allowing all this to happen, they're actually basically selling our province to people in China for hardly anything at all, because by letting them break the law like this and not pursuing judgment in this case, they're actually letting other families do the exact same thing. Well, it worked for them, why won't it work for us, sort of thing. So by not enforcing the law, they're actually making it so that more people will be breaking the law.
Yeah, definitely. And this is happening, and I don't think we heard about this in any of the mainstream media. This is definitely a story that should be out there because I mean, 7 scams, really 7 scams, and that doesn't even raise the radar. That's not right. So
Yeah, other than the one article about this, there's been hardly anything at all about immigration in any of the major papers or the major news outlets. And it's something that should be talked about more, and that's why it's on the show this week.
definitely, and hopefully someone will make it an issue. And I'm guessing that either the 2019 federal election or if there's a BC election sooner. So
we'll have to see, and we'll keep following up on it.
Well, we're going to move on to Canada right now, and this story is one that really showcases the CBC's reporting on various issues. And the headline is from the CBC: members of far-right Storm Alliance attend Trudeau's town hall in Quebec City. So as we all know, Justin Trudeau is doing his town hall cross-country tour. This week he was in Quebec City. And when he was there, questions about our immigration system and how to combat racism were asked. And I mean, I think given our last story, it's good to ask questions about our immigration system. That's just a natural question to ask. So a question was asked pertaining on how to better integrate new immigrants into Canadian society. And as with most times when Trudeau talks about immigration, this ended with the tone of fighting racism. The Prime Minister said there's much more we need to do as citizens to create neighborhoods, a society, a political debate that is more respectful, less anchored in ignorance and insecurity and intolerance. So as you can see there, a question that goes about immigration and integrating new Canadians inevitably goes towards combating racism and whatnot. And I think it goes without saying that if there is someone who is coming to Canada and this person is a real legal immigrant who wants to give it their best shot to make a new life in Canada, they're going to try and integrate into our society. They will want to try and learn English and French and maybe pick up on some of the customs of the area that they're migrating to. That, I think, is what you would want to do if you were a new immigrant to Canada. And it's not something that should inherently lead to racism, talking about this integration of new immigrants into Canadian society. That should be part of our immigration system, no questions asked. So, as you can see, these questions about immigration are perfectly valid and legitimate given the current state of world affairs and last year's underreported illegal migrant surge into Canada from the US. And really, Canada is fortunate for so many reasons. And one of those is that our political system is built on brokerage, and we very seldomly see small fringe parties gain prominence in Parliament. And, because of this doesn't mean that immigration is an issue that should be shied away from. It's very important. Just because all the parties have a view of immigration that is palatable to a vast majority of Canadians, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about immigration and integrating people into society. So this was a great question that was asked, and I think it's par for the course for Trudeau to go that way. But ultimately, the CBC reported on this story with such great detail because in attendance at the Quebec City event were 10 members of the Storm Alliance, which is a group that identifies as ultranationalists. Now, you might be thinking, okay, were they there? Did they do something bad? Well, the CBC made expressive emphasis on the RCMP contingent at the meeting, saying that roughly 7 members of the RCMP stood between the Storm Alliance, who positioned themselves at the back of the room. So with the CBC's expressive reporting on this, you would think that something happened there caused by this group. But they didn't, and the fact it says that the RCMP members were standing between the Storm Alliance and the rest of the group, it makes it sound like they're forming a human barricade or something, but that's not true. The Storm Alliance was there. They were there. They were just calmly taking selfies at the back, listening to the Prime Minister, without causing any actual trouble. But what did happen at the Quebec City Town Hall was there was a man who was removed from one of the previous town halls in London, Ontario, and he started heckling the Prime Minister. He started shouting at the Prime Minister, and he was removed again by police. He unfurled the Canadian flag that was defaced with Nazi symbolism and the words "Evil Empire" and "Fig Leaf" on the flag. The CBC noted that there was no apparent connection between the disruption and the Storm Alliance. Trudeau ultimately said, "Nice to see you again," as the man was hauled off by the RCMP. So, if one wanted to see this story without the dramatic flair, they would need to go to CTV News, who provided a more thorough account of the event, without the quick clickbait headline that the CBC used. Now, there's one final note of importance on this story. The CBC notes that there was no link between the Storm Alliance and the disruption at the town hall, but let's refer back to the headline. Members of far-right Storm Alliance attend Trudeau's town hall in Quebec City. By mentioning the Storm Alliance in the headline, this implies that they were somehow involved at something that happened at this Quebec City town hall, maybe even the heckling. But as you can tell, based on the article, just reading through the article, that didn't happen. It was someone else there who was at a former London, Ontario town hall. So it almost makes as though the CBC is writing this whole article to say, hey, the Storm Alliance was here. But of course, the bigger stories, as we saw, were immigration and the economy and everything that normal Canadians would want to ask the Prime Minister. And mentioning the Storm Alliance really doesn't do anyone any good with this. And, you know, in this, CTV got this right because they didn't even bring the Storm Alliance into it. They mentioned the heckler that was there from the previous London town hall and carried on with the content that the Prime Minister was there talking about.
Yeah, that's right. And when I first saw the story in the CBC, I thought, oh, that's a weird headline. So I looked into the story itself and saw that they were talking all about this Storm Alliance. I'm like, well, who are the Storm Alliance? So then you have to research it to find out. I'm like, well, there's absolutely nothing about them online or whatever. Just one random Facebook group where they were trying to gather to stop people from crossing the border into Quebec, which of course was one of our biggest stories of 2017. And so I was reading through the CBC article here, and they're all talking about how they're just at the back, causing no trouble whatsoever, and that they're taking selfies. And then you have to ask yourself, why did they create a news story about this if they're not causing any trouble and all they were doing was listening to the town hall?
And more importantly, why did they make it sound like the RCMP were there acting as a physical barrier to the Storm Alliance?
Yeah, and comparing the guy who stood up and started heckling with the Nazi symbolism, they're trying to make the connection in between them and the supposed far-right ultra-nationalist Storm Alliance that were just sitting there and not doing anything whatsoever. So they're trying to make links where they don't exist, and it's really bad that that's the story that they let off with on this. I mean, for someone who was wanting to know more about what happened in the town halls and didn't know and wanted basically a summary, which one would expect to find on a news site, that's very odd to see that was what they go with, is they were talking about people that showed up and listened to the town hall.
Yeah, like, and you know, this is almost the kind of article reporting you would expect from a tabloid, which, you know, is saying something. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you know, this could have been what we would have called firing line when the right side started out. But we have taken that one step further this week. So, firing line. Everyone's probably heard about this, but let's hear about it again from the very beginning.
Yeah, so for those who are either outside of the country, well, even those who were outside of the country, but for living under a rock, they might have missed that there was a huge, gigantic media furor over a case where an 11-year-old girl called Kala Noman claimed that a scissors-wielding man came up behind her and cut her hijab repeatedly as she walked to school last Friday, and she described the incidents as one that left her terrified and confused. Now, in the original story that came out, it was described that the man walked up behind her and then pulled off her jacket hood and started cutting the bottom of her hijab. The man ran off, Kala said, noting that she crossed the street with her brother to join other students walking to school. But a short time later, the man approached her from behind again and started cutting her hijab once more, she said. Kala said that she turned around to confront him, but he smiled and ran off again. But that sounds a little fishy, doesn't it? Because if she was wearing a huge coat hood, how could the attacker see her hijab from behind? and then have the time to carefully cut off a foot of cloth from the hijab without cutting the girl or her hair, and without anyone witnessing it, and who just goes around randomly with scissors that are actually capable of cutting cloth. I don't know if you know, but if you just take your normal kitchen scissors or even school scissors, you can't easily cut through cloth very much. You have to have like specialized tailoring scissors for this, and they're pretty gigantic
Yeah.
for the most
Yeah.
part. And so how did no one else witness this? And when someone comes at you with scissors, how do you not run away from that? Because scissors can be pretty harmful if you get stabbed from them.
Oh,
Now,
definitely.
the Toronto District School Board said it was offering support to Kala and her family, as well as other students, and was working with investigators on the case. Now, they set up a huge press conference in the school itself, where the girl's mother and brother were standing beside her as she described the incident. And the little brother is seen smirking and laughing and smiling throughout at his sister throughout the case. It's not exactly an expression one would normally see on someone who would witness such an awful crime on a family member. Now, normally in cases like this, underage witnesses or accusers' identities are hidden to protect the child from harm, and this would especially be in a case where a supposed criminal would come out and be attacking a child. They'd want to hide their identities so that the criminal can't find out and then go after them again, right? But however, the media and the school board were thrusting the girl into the spotlight, and they were actually letting the press conference happen right in the middle of a classroom. And the question you should ask there is, why would that happen even before the police investigation had begun and with the criminal likely still in the area? The girl also seemed remarkably calm giving the interview, given that she was attacked just 90 minutes before. Now, the media storm started at about 9:33 a.m. last Friday when Toronto police tweeted an initial report of an assault at the school involving a man cutting off a student's hijab. At about 10:52 a.m., Toronto police tweeted again that there were now two victims and another person was attacked. 10 minutes later, Toronto police put out another tweet, this time with correction that there is only one victim. She was attacked twice by the same man 10 minutes apart. Now, the story aired on CBC just 45 minutes after the 911 call happened, just 16 minutes after that first tweet by the Toronto police. And politicians jumped on the story right after that, eager to decry the alleged attack. Toronto Mayor John Tory, Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau all issued statements condemning the incident and Islamophobia in general. Posted Trudeau, Canada is an open and welcoming country, and incidents like this cannot be tolerated. Trudeau said his heart goes out to the girl. Quote, I can't imagine how afraid she must have been. I want her and her family and her friends and community to know that is not what Canada is, and that is not who Canadians are. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne called the incident, quote, a cowardly act of hatred. This does not represent who we are. We must stand firm in our support of this young girl who was assaulted simply for wearing a hijab. Now, John Tory added that he was, quote, shocked and appalled. No child should ever be afraid walking to school in Toronto because of what they are wearing or for any other reason. Intolerance and hate of any kind, including Islamophobia, has no place in our city, our province, or our country. Now, after the story made international news, No Man's picture was plastered on the front page of newspapers across Canada, and it was discussed on the radio and shown on the evening news for days. Now, a few days later, the Toronto police concluded their investigation. And the result of that? It didn't happen. Yeah, that's right. It turns out that the whole case was all made up. And on Monday, the Toronto police issued the following brief statement. After a detailed investigation, police have determined that the events described did not happen. Our investigation is concluded, and we don't expect anything further.
I think now is a good time to stop and say that if this did not happen, which the police have concluded that it did not happen, that's fine. Now, I think there's something to be said, especially when there is a purported attack by one person or one group or another, that the Prime Minister, the Premier, and even the Mayor of Toronto stop, wait, and get all of the information before issuing statements for something that may not be true. But it gets worse now. So carry on.
Yeah, that's right. Now, the family has apologized for the quote pain and anger they caused after the girl's claim turned out to not be true. This has been a very painful experience for our family. We want to thank everyone who has shown us support at this difficult time. Again, we are deeply sorry for this and want to express our sincere apologies to every Canadian. In their statement on Wednesday, the girl's family said that when they heard the story, they assumed it to be true, just like everyone else. They added, "We only went public because we were horrified that there was such a perpetrator who may try to harm someone else." Now, a Muslim writer for the Vancouver Metro wrote about how, quote, "a false accusation of a hate crime is rare, but it most hurts communities already reeling from the effect of those inflicting terrorism in the name of their religion. It also undermines the fight against Islamophobia. An incident like this gives people the ammunition to leverage the rare false report and use it to invalidate larger issues of anti-Muslim hate." So they're basically saying that false accusations of hate crime are rare, but aren't we seeing in the news a lot lately how there's been a lot of accusations of crimes, especially in the cases of the sexual assault crimes in Hollywood, where it's turning out that a lot of them are actually made up, and it's interesting how they mentioned that the false accusations of these hate crimes are also rare, when it turns out there's been them in the past where they haven't been true.
Exactly.
And there was actually a case of a man in 2015 who was claiming a hate crime, and they actually arrested someone for it and then found out that the whole thing wasn't true.
All we need to
So
do in this case is go back to one of the episodes from 2017, and we talked about the annual hate crime statistics for the year end 2016. And, you don't hear about this, but the group in Canada that suffers the most hate crimes is the Jewish population. And, you don't hear this kind of outrage and, mass reporting and jumping to statements if there is a hate crime against a Jewish person or someone who is African. You don't hear that.
yeah, exactly. And there's been a lot of hate crime with other groups, but not the news organizations and politicians in general do not jump up on this stuff unless it's something that's become completely newsworthy. Now, a Canadian Muslim organization actually kind of agreed with the Vancouver Metro writer and expressed similar concerns, saying that they feared that others who experience hate crimes may be reluctant to report them out of worry that they will not be believed now that this happened. The spokesman for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat Canada said that it would also be naive to ignore the risk of potential backlash against the girl and her family, as well as other Muslims, in light of Monday's news. There was a lot of people online saying that the girl should be charged, that her family should be charged for public mischief, saying that this was a huge waste of police resources, which is actually true. And that there was a lot of people saying that they should deport the family, that they shouldn't be allowed to stay in Canada, and there was a huge amount of a lot of angry response to this online, and there was a huge uproar of fury against the girl for lying to everyone about the incident. However, I think the real blame should just lay with the media and the school board, who pushed for this to become an international sensation without even doing basic fact-checking. And it should also be with the politicians who jumped on this story for political gain. And it's got to be, they have to feel pretty foolish right after this, finding out that the whole thing didn't actually happen and that they made all these statements up.
Yeah, definitely. And, this also highlights the fact that, the media is quick to deride fake news, and they love saying we are not fake news and we hold ourselves up to journalistic standards and whatnot. We are the gold standard and whatnot. I know that's something that Global and CTV like to do, but, when they are engaged in publishing what is fake news, which I think we can call this case fake news, right?
I think we can.
When they are engaged in publishing fake news, they don't call it fake news. They say it was a journalistic error. Well, if it's a journalistic error for you, why is it then not a journalistic error when someone else does it, you know? And that's the double standard that the media needs to realize, and realize that they are perpetrating, and that's why people call them fake news instead. And that's why this reaches our title of fake news here. And, you know, just one more thing on this. You know, I think at 11 years old, someone who is 11 years old should know that you don't invent a fake crime to have the police come and, you know, start an investigation. I think people by 11 years old probably know that. So there might be something more here, but I don't think we'll see an investigation on that.
No, because she's only 11 years old, clearly there's not going to be much investigation into why she did this or anything.
Yeah, or maybe even if the family was behind it. You don't know.
We won't know, and we can't really speculate on that either. But really, I think in that case, the real blame for this should lie ultimately with that first CBC news story, because you have to remember it happened around 9 o'clock. The first 911 call to the police happened just a little bit after that, just after she'd gotten to school, and then the Toronto police had that first tweet out at 9:33 a.m. The CBC article came out at 9:49 a.m. That was just 16 minutes after that first tweet went out. You have to wonder how on earth were they able to find out about the story, be able to fact check it to make sure it actually happened, go and actually talk to the people involved, and actually decide that it was newsworthy enough to post. Just in 16 minutes. I don't know about you, but I have a very hard time writing up a full article in less than half an hour. It's very difficult to see how they could have actually found out about that beforehand and then posted again. So it makes the questioning there even more worthy, I think, because it shows that the CBC just rushed to post the story without even trying to figure out if it was real or not.
Yeah, definitely. And that is something we see a lot of in the media today. You know, who can get there first, who can get the tweets, who can get the Facebook social media posts out to get the clicks to come into their own website. And that leads very nicely into our word of the week, which is clickbait. And clickbait is defined as something such as a headline that is designed to make readers want to click on a link on the internet, especially when that link leads to content of dubious value or interest. And the example given is of what can sound like clickbait are: you'll never believe what happened when blank, the cutest thing ever, the biggest mistake you can make, or take this quiz to see which character you are on your favorite TV show. And I think we've all seen those kind of links on Google and social media and whatnot. And that is, you know, the bedrock of the internet and how websites like BuzzFeed and whatnot drive traffic. But, you know, that's increasingly become a trend that the media uses to get their stories out. And we see that, you know, this week with the story regarding the Storm Alliance. The Stormfront would be something else, and that's definitely something you'd want to talk about. But also with the hijab story as well. You know, you definitely see that here too. It was a race to see who could get there first and who can, you know, make the biggest headline around it. And then lo and behold, that big headline entices the Prime Minister, the Premier, and the Mayor of Toronto to start commenting. And there we are. We have our firing line for the week. So clickbait is a nasty thing in journalism, and it seems to be constantly a race to the bottom in this day and age with social media and whatnot for news organizations. So
that's very true.
Yeah. All right. Well, that sums up this episode of The Right Side nicely. If you want to find full show notes, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And we're also on social media on Twitter and Facebook at Twitter/RightSideCA and Facebook/RightSideCA. So with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And we'll be here to give you the right side of the news and to cut through all the bias sensationalism that you find in day-to-day life, and to actually make sure that the news that we're talking about is actually correct. So with that, we will see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.